Great Responsibility, Chapter 23. Why? Movie night had gone off well, even if there had been a struggle for the remote at one point. Pepper had brought them several large pizzas about halfway through Fellowship of the Ring. Piper was the only one who liked Hawaiians, so she got a pizza to herself, which was good because ever since she was bitten by the spider, she'd had a faster metabolism than most. Not nearly as fast as Uncle Steve or Uncle Bruce, but fast enough. MJ was staying the night and fell asleep about halfway through Two Towers. Harry was having his driver drop Eddie home after he took Harry home, since Harry was closer. They couldn't stay, as Tony had a strict rule about boys sleeping over at the tower. It was Tony's only strict rule. Once Piper had helped MJ to the spare room she always used and bid the boys good night, escorting them out of the tower, she snuck off into her room and changed into her costume. She had a link up to the police radios that she'd rigged up in her lab. She turned it on and listened for a moment before she flicked it back off, pulled on her mask, and slowly opened her window. These windows on the 30th floor of what had started off as an office building hadn't originally been intended to be opened, but Piper had made some modifications after she'd gotten her powers, including hacking into Jarvis and reprogramming him to ignore her comings and goings as Spider-Girl. She'd also snuck into her father's backup AIs and implanted a similar subroutine in each of them, just in case. She swung off to intercept a heist in progress. Someone on one of the lower levels of the tower watched Spider-Girl swing away and shook her head, long strawberry blonde hair falling into her face. Piper intercepted the man as he leapt away from the jewelry store. She swung in, snatched the bag out of his hand, and dropped it to the angry store clerk below, who caught it out of sheer surprise. Piper flipped midair and kicked the man in the side, sending him flying into a nearby roof. She spotted a streak of light, but paid it no mind as she landed on the roof. The man she'd kicked was familiar. She'd fought him before. He called himself Batroc the Leaper. Out of curiosity, she checked in to see if any of her villains had shield files. Not many did, but the Frightful Four did. But Batroc's was so small it wasn't even really a file. All it said was that he was French and leapt, likely using stolen tech that he wore on his legs. He was also pretty strong for someone who wasn't a mutant, or even physically enhanced. Batroc, don't you know this is my neighborhood? You'd think after getting your butt handed to you by me a few times you'd know better. He groaned and pulled himself to his feet. Piper dropped flat to the roof as he leapt at her face. A blast of light came from her left and knocked Batroc off his feet. She turned. Nova was floating on the edge of the roof. She nodded. She rolled her eyes under her mask and dodged right as Batroc's foot filled the space that had seconds before been where the back of her head was. She elbowed him in the thigh and shot a line of webbing behind her, sticking his other foot to the roof. Sup, Lightbulb? Nova shook his head. You weren't at training, Webbs. Spider-Girl nodded. You already knew that, though, Buckethead. You're here about Save the Citizen, aren't you? Nova nodded as Batroc pulled a knife and sliced through the webbing. Piper dropped into a perfect split as Batroc attempted to grab her from behind. She spun on her hands and knocked him off his feet before webbing both of his arms to the roof, then his legs. Seriously, dude, stay down. She shot at Batroc before turning back to Nova. So, are you just going to float there, or are you going to ask questions? There were so many questions Nova wanted to ask. How did she know more heroes' identities than he did? What was her shield clearance? Could it already be higher than his? How the hell did she program 12 LMDs in less than 3 hours? But he wasn't sure where to start, so he asked a simple, if vague, question. Why? Piper sighed and tapped the side of her web shooter. A small keypad popped up, and she typed out a quick message. A piece of webbing shot out of the base of her web shooter, and Piper stuck it to Batroc's forehead. It read, "Careful of the legs on this one, your friendly neighborhood Spider-Girl." She webbed his legs down a few more times just to be safe. Nova tapped his foot on thin air until Spidey raised an eyebrow under her mask at him, and he stopped. She stepped up in front of him. Not here. Come on, I'm starving. Nova raised an eyebrow at her, but let her lead him further into Queens. She climbed down the side of a building that had a deli at street level. The sign above the store read Delmar's, and it was still open, even at nearly midnight. Painted in one of the windows was a small circle that had Piper's mask painted in it. Nova raised an eyebrow but floated into the store after her. She didn't remove her mask, but the man behind the counter smiled. "Spidey, good to see you, the usual." Piper nodded. "Can you make it two, Mr. Delmar? Extra pickles on mine, please, and squash it as flat as you can." The other man behind the counter nodded, and Piper reached for the waist of her suit. Mr. Delmar shook his head. "Don't you dare, hero. You saved my life and my store. You don't pay here. That's what the symbol in my window is for." Piper frowned behind her mask. "But I usually only get one. I don't want to trouble you, Mr. Delmar." He shook his head again. "Any friend of yours is a friend of mine, Spidey. Don't worry about it." Piper grinned under her mask and moved off to the side to pet the cat that lay on the counter. She motioned Nova over. "Nova, this is Mr. Delmar, and this is Claude, his cat." Mr. Delmar smiled and held out a hand to Nova. "I meant that. Any friend of Spider-Girl's is a friend of mine. She saved my life when someone tried to rob my store." "I didn't think anyone was going to help, because none of those big-time heroes care about the little people like me, but she swooped in and saved my life and my store. She comes by to check on me every so often since, and now I got a rule in my store. Heroes eat free, whatever they want." Nova was a bit surprised, but he shook the man's hand, careful to turn down the glow a bit as he did. He didn't want to burn him. "Also, he's got the best sandwiches in Queens." Mr. Delmar grinned and thanked her. Sandwiches were handed over to Spidey, and she handed them to Nova and fist-bumped Mr. Delmar. She swung off after thanking him again, but she only pulled herself out of the building, waiting for Nova. She pinned another of her web notes. This one read, "Thanks, Mr. Delmar, your friendly neighborhood Spider-Girl." She stuck it to the outside window after pulling a $100 bill from a small compartment on a hidden belt that she wore under the top of her costume. Then she swung away. As she paused on the roof across the street, Nova spotted Mr. Delmar coming out of the store. He grinned and waved at the hero across the street. She waved back and then swung off, Nova hot on her heels, the bag still in his hands. Piper stopped nearly 6 blocks away and sat down on the edge of an apartment building. Nova hovered awkwardly, the plastic bag still in his hands. Piper patted the stones next to her, and Nova took her invitation and sat down next to her. She took the bag and handed him a sandwich, taking out a flattened one for herself. She pulled up her mask so the edge sat on the bridge of her nose and frowned. There was still something in the bag. She reached in and pulled out 2 brownies. Her grin nearly split her face. Nova was getting very confused. "You never answered my question. Why did you create Save the Citizen?" Piper had taken a big bite of her sandwich, so she took a moment to chew before she responded. She pointed across the street at where a bank sat. "See that bank?" Nova nodded. "I tried to stop a heist there once." Nova's eyebrows rose. "Tried?" Piper nodded. "Tried. I failed because Thundra threw an ATM in part of a wall at this little family of 3. The mother was pregnant at the time. They put in the paper that the family named the little boy Dare, 'cause Spider." She turned and pointed towards an alley a bit farther away from them. "I stopped a mugging there. This older lady was trying to get her groceries home when these 2 teens jumped her. I got there in time, and she didn't get hurt, so that was good. I helped her carry her groceries home. Her name is Pearl. Her grandkids don't call her nearly often enough, and whenever it gets cold, she leaves hats and scarves for me on her fire escape. She knits them herself. She reminds me of my Aunt May." Nova was seriously confused now. "Okay, that still doesn't answer my question." Piper sighed and took another bite of her sandwich. She chewed slowly, then spoke again. "I created Save the Citizen because life is important. Too many heroes take the little things for granted. We can't do that. If we do, we'll forget why we started this in the first place. I don't really know your stories, how any of the rest of the team got started, but I started to honor the memory of someone I lost, of everyone I've ever lost. I can't honor them if I just beat the bad guy. It's not enough. I have to remember to protect the people who can't protect themselves. Nova was a little stunned. He'd been starting to think that she'd created it to make her teammates look silly. But looking at her now, he saw something in the small bit of her face he could see. He could almost call it determination, but there was something else there, too. An almost melancholy expression sat on the face of this normally upbeat hero. He was starting to see why Fury put her in charge. She checked the watch function on her communicator, and it was nearly 1 a.m. She stood. Well, I need to get home before someone realizes I'm gone. Think about what I said, Nova. Think about why you're in this business. She rewrapped what remained of her sandwich and one of the brownies and tucked them away in her belt. He frowned slightly as she finished making sure nothing would fall. She smiled at him before she pulled down her mask. Don't let that sandwich go to waste. Seriously, best sandwich in Queens. I'll see you tomorrow, Nova. With that, she swung off, leaving Nova alone with his thoughts.